This video concept started with me wanting to cover some of the most iconic prison break stories that happened in Montana. Through my research, I found things that were akin to a Hollywood production of something like Escape from Alcatraz or The Shawshank Redemption. Although these stories had similar notes, I found it to be much richer as it was based off real Montana history. This Montana State Prison topic actually became so big that I want to break it into 3 different videos. The first one focusing on its most controversial and first warden, Frank Conley, who, by the way, was brutally attacked in an escape attempt but ended up coming out on top, which we're going to talk about later in this video. The second thing that I want to cover, that I'm going to give its own entire standalone video, is the 1950s riots. These were 3 riots that all built on top of each other, and while I need to do more research for that video, I'm pretty sure there's a bazooka in it. So personally, I would subscribe just so I can hear about someone shooting a bazooka at the prison. But that's just me. The third part is going to be on the paranormal side of the old Montana State Prison, as it is now shut down and used for historical purposes and paranormal purposes, as prisoner and guard spirits still supposedly haunt the halls, leaving scratches on visitors and making their presence known. I actually plan on visiting Deer Lodge and going to the Montana State Prison, so I'm really excited for that third video. I hope you guys are excited for those upcoming videos. Make sure to subscribe and put on notifications so you can see them when they come out. But for now, let's focus on the history, inception of the Montana State Prison, and its first controversial warden, Frank Conley. So, fun fact about Frank Conley, the first warden of the Montana State Prison, was that he actually wasn't the first warden of that prison. This is possible because Montana State Prison was founded in 1889 after Montana became a state. The prison grounds were there previously, and Frank Conley was just a guard, not necessarily the warden. Although it was Frank Conley with his partner Thomas Mateague who stepped up to then run the prison under contract of the state starting in 1889. So by technicality, he was the first warden of the Montana State Prison, even though the prison grounds were there before Montana was actually even considered a state. The partnership that Conley had with Mateague worked like this. Conley would handle the day-to-day operations of the prison, being the man on site, aka the warden, where Mateague would handle the finances, doing accounting and getting payments towards the prison, making sure that it ran at a cost-effective rate. With this being such a pivotal time in Montana history, I did a little deep dive into what was going on at the time and what it looked like, what a prisoner of a Montana State Prison would be. And what I found was there was a lot of ranch crimes and gang activity, as well as previously established vigilante law that was common in the state of Montana. So much so that I think I want to cover some of the gang criminal activity that happened in Montana, as well as the vigilantes that went to stop the crime. I think that will be a very interesting topic for another video. But for right now, all you need to know is that in 1864, Montana became a U.S. territory, and in 1883, the North Pacific Railroad brought settlers, supplies, and industry to the territory of Montana, opening it up to trade, commerce, and agriculture. While Montana in the late 1800s was no stranger to violent crimes, slowly the gang activity and the vigilante justice was being replaced with established law enforcement. Like previously mentioned, it is 1889 when Montana first becomes a state, and that's where we find Frank Conley taking over the Montana State Prison. During this time of transition between the rough old ways of the West and some new law enforcement reform. Frank Conley was born in Maryland in 1864. And by the age of 1, he already had lost his father. Soon after, he also lost his mother, becoming an early orphan. Things weren't all lost as he still had his brothers. However, he did have to grow up extremely quick, and his formal schooling ended at the age of 14. It wasn't until 1880, at the age of 16, he followed his brothers out to the wonderful state of Montana. Originally, he started out surveying the Yellowstone area. While being a really cool job, we don't have any specific details of what he did, although we can imagine he was mapping out some terrain and laying down the original foundation and infrastructure of what eventually would become Yellowstone National Park. Speaking of Yellowstone National Park, I recently made a video on the 1959 Yellowstone earthquake, which affected the park greatly, changing some of the geyser eruption timings, as well as creating a new lake. So if you're interested in Yellowstone National Park, I highly recommend checking out that video after this one. After his brief stunt surveying the Yellowstone area, Conley moved to Miles City. It was there where he signed a vigilante pledge aiming on getting rid of criminals in the area. I found this quote talking about the pledge, and apparently it went, "Select and name such of bad men of our community as shall be dealt with by us, and decide what we shall do with them, whether they shall be doomed to die or otherwise." Conley rose among the ranks of the vigilantes and was soon known as the Batman of Miles City. Just kidding, that didn't happen, but it would have been cool. However, Conley did soon become a sheriff deputy in Miles City, working for the police department, hunting down criminals in the area. I couldn't find anything of significance that happened while he was a sheriff deputy in the area, but you can imagine it was ruffians and gangs that had to be dealt with, just general lawlessness on the frontier. It was in 1986 when escorting 2 men to the prison in Deer Lodge, where Conley decided that his days as a sheriff deputy were over and he was going to transition into being a prison guard. Like I said previously, it was in 1889 when Montana gained its statehood, and while Frank Conley was a guard previously, he stepped up to become the first warden of the Montana State Prison alongside his partner, Thomas Mateague. Under the contract that they had with the state, they were responsible for housing, feeding, and disciplining the inmates, all while being able to make a profit if they were financially stable. This agreement is what led to his long tenure as the warden of the Montana State Prison, where he became super well known for his controversial but also influential prison reform. When he inherited the prison or signed the contract with the state, he needed to make lots of improvements to the security, as well as just making the buildings more sound. This is going to be a common theme with Conley. He was constantly trying to build up the prison. Conley's ambition to build up the prison would not stop for decades, and eventually the state of Montana actually wanted to move the prison from Deer Lodge to Billings, but because of financial trouble, they couldn't do that, and the prison stayed in Deer Lodge, and eventually they supported Conley improving the facility, something that he's been doing ever since he became the warden. Increasing capacity also kind of increases how much money he can make from taking care of these prisoners. While the state of Montana allowed Frank Conley to improve the prison, they didn't necessarily give him the funds to do so, and this is where Frank Conley's most infamous, controversial, and well-known fact of his reform comes from. It was the convict labor. The convicts would actually build up the prison that they were staying in. Conley was very proud of this, seeing as it was something that led to people making a change and actually reforming from criminal to part of society, and of course it also helped out the prison quite a bit. Everyone in the construction crew that built up the wall and improved the prison at the time was a convict, except for the foreman and the superintendent that handled the construction. Of course, there was some pushback with this from labor unions saying that this was immoral, and other people just not liking that convict labor was being used, but Conley pushed forward and kept building. He expanded a wall and then built a women's quarters, kitchen, dining hall, and even a theater for the inmates. Makes me think of the Green Mile, which I just watched here in this apartment with a couple of my friends, which is probably one of the saddest movies ever. You've seen the Green Mile, you know what I'm talking about, and if you haven't seen it, you should watch it. Conley would expand his convict labor program to be outside of the prison. Things like highways and state buildings would be built by these convicts. With a lot of these inmates working on crews that worked on buildings outside of the prison was making quite a bit of money, and there was some financial questionable decisions that go down in Conley's legacy, painting not quite the best picture. When you look into Frank Conley, you'll see that he is a very controversial character. And honestly, a lot of the articles that I saw were talking about good things, but I think the financial side and this convict labor is where people get a little shady aspect of what Frank Conley was doing. With the convict labor program, a lot of prisoners were actually able to live off-site, being less heavily guarded, and offered reduced prison sentences. So it was a pretty good deal for these guys to start doing a little bit of work and building up these state buildings and highways. And of course, if they messed up, they got into some bad business, they would be sent right behind bars back at the prison, maximum security. Overall, it was this convict labor and the finances gained from it that became Conley's most famous and infamous legacy. Some people praising it, looking at the positives, and believing that the work actually helped the inmates, giving the inmates a chance of discipline and earning their keep, while also being less confined to the prison walls. While other people look at the finances, think it's a little bit shady, while also thinking it's immoral to put these convicts through labor. What made me think of the Shawshank Redemption was the finance side, because Frank Conley had these questionable finances that people thought were a little bit fraudulent, and that's part of his controversy. And if you've seen the Shawshank Redemption, the main character is doing the Warden's finances. So that was the tie in my brain that made me connect the dots there, but I don't know. What do you guys think? I think it's about time we cover the brutal and bloody escape attempt that nearly killed Frank Conley. On March 8, 1908, two inmates, George Rock and W.A. Haynes, launched a violent attack in order to escape and break free from the prison. Rock was incarcerated for murder, while Haynes was there for horse theft. They had two lesser-known accomplices, C.B. Young and Orem Stevens. An important element of this escape attempt is that Haynes was able to get his hands on a guard's pocket knife before they even attempted the escape. Through this, the attempt was way more bloody and violent than it probably would have been if he went in unarmed. The escape started with the four men asking to see Conley during one of his visiting hours. He actually allowed prisoners to come up and air their grievances with him in person. This was made possible because Frank Conley wasn't scared of the inmates. Standing at 6'4" with a pistol on his hip, he wasn't scared of whatever came his way and frequently met with inmates if they wished to speak with him. The assault started by taking out the deputy warden. He was waiting outside of Frank Conley's office and ended up being beat by a horse bridle. If you don't know what a horse bridle is, it's basically the thing that goes around the horse's mouth. It doesn't go into detail how they beat him up with it, but you can imagine that they were hitting him almost in like a whipping fashion that would really hurt with some hard leather and especially the metal pieces. This is a very unique and brutal way for them to attack the guard, but in prison, I'm guessing they had to do whatever they could to get the upper hand to hopefully find freedom for themselves. Haynes then burst into Conley's office, waving the knife that he had stolen, threatening him, demanding to be set free. Conley responded by pulling his pistol and shooting at the inmate, hitting him in his ear. Soon after, Rock rushed into the room, this time with the deputy warden in his hands as a body shield. This didn't deter Warden Conley, as he was still able to get the upper hand and shoot down Rock. Rock was shot in the head and Haynes in the lungs twice, but they still kept going after Conley. Conley unloaded his pistol, shooting every single bullet that he had until all he had to defend himself was a chair and the butt of his pistol, whacking it against the men until help was able to arrive and save his life. When it was all said and done, Conley sustained 50 stab wounds and needed 103 stitches. One wound was so close to his jugular that it's a miracle that he didn't bleed out and die himself. Unfortunately, there was one guard that ended up losing his life in this incident, the same one that was assaulted and used as a body shield. This was Chief Deputy James Robinson, who was brutally mutilated and had his neck slit. Now, while this is the more definitive version of the assault, I was able to find a somewhat different version that still ended up with the same result, but had a slightly different sequence of events, and the positioning of the people was different as well. This alternate version of events had a few key differences that I wanted to highlight, some of them being almost comical and other elements being more sadistic and making the whole scene seem more horrendous. The comical aspect is that instead of Rock rushing into the room after Haynes was shot at, it's Rock and the other two inmates rush into the room, with Conley shooting at them, chasing them down, almost in this comical, like silent movie fashion. The Three Stooges bust through a door and then they're hunted down by a guy and they're just kind of running in between these two rooms. But what became comical turned sadistic as I later read that he found Rock over the deputy warden, where Conley then moved Rock, finding the deputy warden had his throat slit. A more horrific scene as he uncovers that his co-worker and probably friend, at least acquaintance, had been brutally murdered. While this scenario is interesting, I don't think it's as credible as the story where Haynes busts into the room and then Rock comes in with the guard, threatening to kill the guard as well. I think that makes more sense, and I found more sources that talked about it that way. While Rock and Haynes were shot, neither men were allowed to die, because Frank Conley will have his revenge. He nursed both men back to health just so they could be tried and put to death in his prison. In fact, both men were the only two prisoners to ever be hung in Montana State Prison history. Seems like historically the other two lesser-known inmates that tried to escape actually had much less to do with the escape attempt and weren't involved in the crazy violence of this crime. One of the other assailants actually got off scot-free with no charges brought up against him, and the other one had years added to his sentence, where Haynes and Rock both were put to death. And this is just one of many incidents that gives Montana State Prison its notorious, infamous, darkly clouded past. It also feeds into the paranormal phenomenon that is found in the Montana State Prison, where it is said that you can hear ghosts slamming doors, speaking in tongues, and wandering the halls. And like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, make sure you subscribe and like this video so I know that you want to see a video where I go and visit the Montana State Prison and I talk about all the paranormal happenings that occur there. 1920 marked the downfall of Frank Conley's reign as the warden of the Montana State Prison. As a reformer, Joseph Dixon came into power and found Conley's management to be problematic. And it was in 1921 when Conley officially left the prison and stopped being its warden. However, when Frank Conley left in 1921, he took all of his investments, including equipment and infrastructure that he put into the prison as he was running it as a for-profit business, and half of the current staff. This, of course, left the new warden very upset, and he was complaining heavily that Frank Conley defrauded the Montana State Prison. Because of this, Frank Conley was put on trial where he was accused of defrauding Montana about $300,000. But just like the previous escape attempt that nearly cost Conley his life, he would stand his ground and come out on top. Frank Conley ended up being owed by Montana State about $558. While serving his time as the warden of the Montana State Prison, he was also elected mayor of Deer Lodge, being elected 3 times, winning re-election a whole bunch, and apparently serving 31 years as the mayor. And by the time he stepped down in 1929, he held the record for serving the longest term in office in Montana. After his time being the warden of the Montana State Prison, Frank Conley put his hands in the Highway Commission. This was a group that was dedicated to putting a highway that ran all the way through the state of Montana. So if you're like me and you enjoy road trips to from place to place in this beautiful state, shout out Frank Conley. Today, Conley's legacy is deeply tied to his convict labor reform. This prison model was replicated and used as a base for a lot of surrounding states and served as an inspiration for other prison systems to run off of. However, unfortunately, after Conley left his position of warden of the prison, and with the Great Depression hitting a couple of years later, it was really hard for new wardens to follow suit with the convict labor system. And honestly, opportunities were drying up left and right as convict labor wasn't really an option anymore. Frank Conley's story comes to an end with his wife passing away in 1939 and him soon following suit, dying on March 5th, 1939. Upon his death, the community of Deer Lodge, with him being so ingrained in it, decided to honor him by not opening shop on the day of his funeral and scattered him and his wife's ashes on Mount Powell, which is a Deer Lodge landmark. I hope you guys really did enjoy this video on Frank Conley and the Montana State Prison. Like I said in the beginning, I'm planning on doing 2 other videos on the Montana State Prison. I might even push for a 3rd. If you enjoyed this and you really want to see those, make sure you like the video so I know that this is something that you want to see in the future. And make sure to check out some of my other videos that I've worked pretty hard in. I'm going to put a playlist in the description that has literally every other video that I've made. And it really means a lot that you guys have stuck with me for the last about 20 minutes. So from me to you, thank you. And if you enjoyed, subscribe so you can see all my other videos, and we can hang out again sometime in the future. Have a good one.